Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. For those of you who enjoy listening to the podcast, please give us a ratings and review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to see a video version, please go to my YouTube page. And if you go to my website, drweitz.com, you can find detailed show notes and a complete transcript. Today, I will be talking to the medical writer, Ralph Moss, PhD, who has written or edited 14 books and collaborated on 4 film documentaries related to cancer research and treatment. We will be talking about modern cancer treatment, especially chemotherapy and some of the newer targeted medications. Dr. Moss is the former science writer and assistant director of public affairs at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York back in the 70s. Since leaving Sloan Kettering, Dr. Moss has independently evaluated the claims of conventional and non-conventional cancer treatments all over the world, and he currently writes the Moss Reports, which are very detailed reports on the most common cancer diagnoses for laypersons, and he also provides informational and personalized consultations for cancer patients and their families. Dr. Moss was also a founding member of the National Institute of Health's Alternative Medicine Program Advisory Council, and he has served as a peer reviewer for a dozen medical journals. Dr. Moss, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I definitely want to focus our talk on your latest book, The Cancer Industry. But before we do...
Cancer Incorporated.
Cancer Incorporated. Okay, sorry about that. Cancer Incorporated. But before we do, I wanted to ask you a few questions about the current coronavirus pandemic situation that we're in. At the time of this filming, that's what's going on right now in the country. And you can tell from this mark on my nose from wearing a face mask almost the entire day, which is not something I'm used to since I don't work in an emergency room. I'm in private practice. So I know that you're an expert at cancer, but you're also an expert at integrative approaches to cancer. And as I think about this pandemic, I think that the way I like to look at a viral epidemic like this is the key, I think, from an integrative functional medicine perspective is that we want to make the host, which is us, very inhospitable to the virus taking root and growing. And I think of integrative cancer care the same way. We want to make the terrain of our body hostile for cancer to be able to take root and grow. So from your perspective, what are some of the most important things that we can do to protect our bodies against this coronavirus that's spreading around the world right now?
Well, I'm not, as you say, I am not an expert on this topic.
Right.
Just, with the other 320 million Americans trying to figure out how to survive in all of this, and given my age and some other health conditions, you know, I kind of feel personally that this is, my wife and I are at increased risk. So we're very vigorously following the standard recommendation and treating it like it is already in our area, although I live in Maine and we have not been hard hit in the rural parts of Maine. But of course, I think if every particle of coronavirus were visible with a little light on it, we'd probably be amazed at how widespread this thing is. At least that's how we conceptualize it. So we do take very seriously the need to wear a mask and gloves and all the rest of it. And in our community, which is a very small community, the neighbors have gotten together and made a kind of group plan where we're all in touch via instant messaging, which initially was for helping each other do shopping, and we've utilized that. But it also is a way to keep in touch and know if anybody's gotten sick and where things stand. We got the first notice we got of the lockdown of the state was through that little informal messaging system. I think this is going on all over the country. It's very, very good. And kind of oddly, the social distancing has led to some greater closeness among neighbors in some parts, at least. And this has been very good.
Well, that would be a great positive that could come out of this situation, is if it actually brings the country together to fight this common
no doubt. And I think history will be rewritten to be pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. I see it as that. Let me just get rid of this call. So, as far as what one could do about it, now I think of this in two different ways. One is what can you do personally, and then the other one is what could you do in society-wise. And personally, I've written a blog about mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms. Why? Because the strengthening of the immune system and the healing healthfulness of the immune system, I think, is very important. So the things you would normally do to keep your immune system healthy and keep the numbers in a high normal range would be beneficial. And the most neglected supplement in that regard, I think, are the medicinal mushrooms, which have a tremendous amount of research behind them in Asia, not so much in the US. And people go to my website, which is mossreports.com. They'll find my blog about this and how you could prepare a soup out of medicinal mushrooms, especially shiitake, maitake, and reishi, or oyster mushrooms. So amazingly, almost all of the exotic Asian mushrooms also double as immune modulators. So I think that's important. A woman that I knew when I worked as a consultant to the National Institutes of Health, Jennifer Jacobs, MD, has put out a blog about homeopathy and COVID-19, which I thought was very interesting. She's had 40 years experience. She's a medical doctor. She's had 40 years experience with homeopathy. So I think her word, should be taken seriously. And then I think also from a societal point of view, the ideas that have intrigued me the most about potential treatments have been the ones that work on the immune system, and two in particular. And I've written a blog about one of them, and the other one is very much in the news if people search for it. So the first one is called super infection therapy. And it seems like a contradiction in terms to give an infection on top of an already existing infection. This has been used in the treatment of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and seasonal influenza, flu. In Russia from the 60s to the 80s, hundreds of thousands of people got basically non-infectious, disease-causing super infections were deliberately given this. And some of them were given, for instance, the Sabin oral polio vaccine. So what would that do? Well, there's a funny thing called super infection where if you have an infection, you give another infection on top of it. Sometimes that second infection knocks out the first infection. It's like they're competing for the same ground. You can think of it that way. And the other idea is that the super infection, the second infection, stimulates the immune system in a non-specific way that then enhances your ability to deal with the first one. Whatever the reason is, there is a lot of potential to this, and it's been shown in other situations. This may be applicable to SARS type of infections, coronaviruses, and so forth. And there is a petition at the White House. The White House has a petition process, and we have started a petition basically to bring this to the attention of Anthony Fauci, who is big top scientist on the president's COVID-19 task force. So we're hoping, it's a long shot, but if you get 100,000 signatures on a petition to the White House, somebody in the White House has to respond to it. So we're trying. What else can we do, right? I mean, there isn't much more. We're trying to
just let President Trump know how he can personally make an investment in a company that provides this therapy, and you'll be golden. It'll be on every press conference.
But my problem in life is I'm always trying to find the least expensive, least profitable treatments.
Okay.
To me, the most effective treatment would be water or something that was,
sleep, exercise, walking, right?
Go
meditation,
walk in the pine forests in Maine, and it might be the best treatment. But what I'm saying is that's a treatment that would be incredibly inexpensive, because it's the one that they use in Europe experimentally is a poultry virus. These poultry viruses are very good because they are highly contagious and active, but they don't cause any human diseases. There's a couple of them. So one of them is currently being proposed as a treatment. Now we're not asking for any more than a fair test, initially like a pilot study in maybe 10 patients to start. And then, of course, work through the clinical trials, although the clinical trial system seems to be tremendously under stress now for the obvious reasons.
Oh, sure. But there actually are a huge number of clinical trials that the FDA is allowing without the sort of normal controls because of the situation we're in. So actually, part of the scientific community is very excited about the ability to launch some of these treatments.
The other treatment that interests me very much is BCG, Bacillus-Calmette-Guerin, which is the standard TB vaccine.
They use that for bladder cancer sometimes.
Correct. That was their first use, repurposed use in cancer, and it's used at very high level, instilled into the bladder mainly to prevent recurrences of bladder cancers, which are relatively easy to treat, but very difficult to keep from coming back. So they use the BCG, instill it. But BCG has many uses. It's been used in literally over 1 billion people. It's given to babies. It's considered, of course, a very safe thing, and its use seems to correlate with lower rates of viral infections. But more importantly, BCG is being tried in Europe as a way of actually treating people. Again, I think the philosophy is almost identical to superinfection therapy, in that it makes a non-specific stimulation of the immune system. And that can be enough to help the person in the initial stages to keep that virus from, taking over the lungs. So I think that this is very important. And one more thing I'll mention, which is, and it came out, there was an article about it today in the New York Times, but there have been hints of this all along, which is that the greatest number of fatalities from COVID-19 are occurring in areas with high rates of air pollution. I thought about this because luckily enough, and not by accident, I live in an area with very little air pollution. We get what blows up the coast from Boston, and maybe Portland, but that's about it. So if you
So it's probably a great idea that the president right now is trying to reduce the new fuel emission standards on cars.
Well, nature is carrying out an experiment, which is to reduce air pollution. So we got the Green New Deal, but we got it in a way we never expected. all the industry is shut down. Car manufacturing is all shut down and so forth. So in a way, I mean, it's ironic that, it took that in order to get us to reduce our pollution of the planet. But I'm not saying this is more like a long-term thing.
Sure.
But it also points to the fact that the health of the lungs proves critical in a surprise, right? In a respiratory disease. So whatever you can do to improve the health of your lungs, whether it's through exercise or through supplements, through walking in the woods, whatever you need to do, that would be a beneficial thing.
Right. Cool. I've really been enjoying this discussion, but now I'd like to pause to tell you about the sponsor for this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Pure Encapsulations, which is one of the few lines of professional nutritional supplements that I use in my office. Pure Encapsulations manufactures a complete line of hypoallergenic, research-based dietary supplements. Pure products are meticulously formulated using pure, scientifically tested and validated ingredients. They are free from magnesium stearate, gluten, GMOs, hydrogenated fats, artificial colors, sweeteners, and preservatives. Among other things, one of the great things about Pure Encapsulations is not just the quality products, but the fact that they often provide a range of different dosages and sizes, which makes it easy to find the right product for the right patient, especially since we do a lot of testing and we figure out exactly what the patients need. So, for example, with DHEA, they offer 5, 10, and 25 milligram dosages in both 60 and 180 capsules per bottle size, which is extremely convenient. And now, back to our discussion. Let's talk about your book, Cancer Incorporated, which talks about the flaws in the war on cancer and the drugs that the ties between the researchers and the drug companies and the regulators.
Yes. So I wrote the book. It took me about a year to do this, and it just came out in January. Of course, then overwhelmed by our more pressing problems, but the cancer problem is not going away. And it will.
And in fact, patients who are currently undergoing some of these treatments for cancer are actually at increased risk of COVID-19 infection and having a worse response as well.
Absolutely. And it's a disaster especially for cancer patients, especially for people with lung cancer. It's a terrible situation. What I focused on in Cancer Incorporated, though, is the manner in which these new drugs in particular, have been presented to the public, and what I see as the corruption of the oncology profession, the leading cancer researchers, in terms of approving drugs and getting the FDA to approve drugs that are not really effective. And I was sort of led to this by the speech that James P. Allison of the MD Anderson Cancer Center gave upon accepting the Nobel Prize in December of 2018. He was contrasting a treatment that he invented called Yervoy, which is a kind of immune therapy, with all previous drugs, like so-called targeted drugs. And he made a comment that, I can't quote exactly, but basically on average, that these drugs extend survival by a few months. You push the envelope by a few months. When I looked into this, I was startled. I hadn't realized, as critical as I've been of the cancer industry, I hadn't realized that it was that limited. And when I looked into this, I found that it was, in fact, the actual increase in overall survival from these new drugs in stage 4 cancers. We have to specify, we're not talking about pediatric cancers or relatively rare kinds of cancer, but on average, for the solid tumors of adults in the final stage, in the stage 4, metastatic disease, is I think.
And for those who are not aware, stage 4 means that the cancer is now spread from the initial organ
correct.
where it was throughout the other parts of the body.
Correct. So it's about 3.8 months. That's what this clinical trials show vis-a-vis the actual benefit on average of all of these targeted drugs that are now the bulk of the drugs that are being approved, or what would be called targeted drugs. And even with the immunotherapy, which I do believe in general terms, it's really only about 5 or 6 months on average. Now you hear about people being cured by immunotherapy, and this is true. For example,
former Vice President Jimmy Carter, who was diagnosed. Former President Jimmy Carter, who was diagnosed with, I think it was metastatic. What was it?
Melanoma spread to the brain. Yeah,
spread to the brain, and it's been years now, and he seems to be doing phenomenally well.
And he did have a pinpoint radiation to the brain, but especially in an older person like himself, and he's I think in his 90s. You wouldn't expect that to result in a.
And he had he takes one of these targeted meds, or took one of these targeted meds, right?
He took one of the very first immunotherapy drugs. So the targeted drugs could be divided into precision medicine, let's say, and then a subset of that would be immunotherapy. It's a different.
And by the way, these are somewhat of an improvement over the traditional chemotherapy, which were basically drugs that just kill everything and are designed to kill the cancer cells, and hopefully they don't kill you, whereas these targeted drugs don't have as many of the side effects.
No. And that was the main selling point of them. But I go in great detail in Cancer Incorporated into what these drugs actually do and the manner in which they've been approved. And I think it's, I was shocked by what I found, because there's a couple of things. One is that now we're not talking about fraud here, which sometimes occurs, but I'm not saying that there's actual making up of data. It isn't that. Okay, so people can disabuse themselves of that notion. It does happen, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's not the general course of things. What I'm talking about is that most of the time, the drugs are approved by FDA based upon a surrogate marker. A surrogate marker means I can't prove to you that the drug actually conveys true patient benefit, but I'll choose something else like a score on a test or I'll redefine what I mean by benefit so that I can then get approval. And the main scam going on here, and it is a scam, is a drug to be effective, for a cancer drug to be effective in stage 4 cancer, it basically has to do one of 3 things. First of all, it could cure you. That would be great. You take the drug, you have a complete response to the drug, meaning that the cancer disappears, and you live out your normal lifespan. That would be a cure. Second thing, it could extend your survival in a meaningful way. So what would that be? Meaning that in the group as a whole, because we're not going to just consider anecdotes, we're going to individual cases, we're going to consider the entire group being tested, they live months or years longer than they would have if they took a different treatment, or if they took no treatment, or they just got best supportive care. That would be increased overall survival. Okay, that's another palpable benefit of treatment. The third one would be increased quality of life. So, but the vast majority of drugs do not cure. They do not, they're almost never tested for quality of life, very rare. Or they don't really extend overall survival. So how could it be then? How could the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or the equivalent agencies abroad, how could they approve a drug without it showing any benefit? And the answer is that there are a dozen definitions of survival at the National Cancer Institute Dictionary. cancer terms. And they usually substitute something like disease-free survival or progression-free survival. What does that mean? So it means that between the time that they administer the treatment and the time that they first notice that the cancer is in fact getting bigger, progressing, spreading to other organs, whatever, that period of time, the progression-free time, is longer in the patients who get the treatment than in those who don't. So now, when you read a headline that says such and such a drug increases survival in cancer patients, most often, if you drill down or bother to read the article, not just the headline, much less read the actual study that it's based upon, not just the abstract, but the actual study, you find that what they've done is they kind of changed the shape of the curve. They moved it over so that some more time elapsed between the time the person was treated and first treated and the time that they first noticed the disease is progressing. But they didn't increase the actual time the patient lived. So I give an illustration of how that could be. You have two people, the patient A and patient B. And so patient A and B they have the same disease, same stage of same type of cancer. They're both treated on, let's say, January 1st. And one of them gets the experimental drug and one of them gets no further treatment, okay? And so at 3 months, there's no sign of further progression in patient A, but patient B is going downhill. The cancer's still growing. It's still causing a problem. At the 6-month point, patient B, of course, is still going downhill. Patient A, they detect that patient A actually now has an increase in a progression of the cancer. And they both continue downhill from there, and they both die exactly 1 year after starting the treatment. So from a common sense or patient or layperson's point of view, what exactly was the difference between those two cases? They both lived exactly to the day, 1 year from the time that they started the treatment. It didn't make any difference. If you take the word survival to mean increased lifespan, which I think 99% of people would, it didn't make any difference. And so did patient A have a better quality of life? That's debatable. Patient A had a period of false hope, let's say, a period of 6 months where she thought that she was maybe going to be cured. But during that time, she was getting this toxic drug. So she may have spent that time in very, very difficult, uncomfortable, or dangerous circumstances. So which is better? I don't know. No one has ever figured that out, because I think it depends on the person. What do you want, that period of that false hope of 6 months, and you can sort of enjoy that and have a more normal existence, or do you want to just accept your fate, not do anything, and sort of slowly go down? I don't know. I'm not sure.
You know who benefits from that?
Right.
The executives and the shareholders of the big pharma company that are making more profits from this drug that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars for 1 year of treatment,
and can have horrendous side effects. Yes, it's true that with chemotherapy, one of the most brutal treatments ever invented, chemotherapy, probably the most poisonous substances deliberately given to human beings since the bloodletting era or the mercury era, whatever you want to call it. But yes, you don't get that kind of but you get other toxicities, some weird things. I mean, and even with the immunotherapy, which, as I say, for highly mutated cancers like melanomas and lung cancers, can be very effective, but the guidebook on the side effects, the side effects of those new immunotherapy runs to, I think it's like 65 pages of fine print for what can occur following this kind of immunotherapy.
By the way, which are some of the examples of some of the immunotherapies, and how do those drugs work?
Right. So it's Yervoy and Opdivo and Keytruda which are heavily advertised to the public, by the way. Only two countries in the world.
Is it Yervoy, the drug that Carter was given?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
It was either that or, I think it was, or it was Opdivo. But yes, I think it was Yervoy because that was the first one to be developed. So, and then there's Tecentriq, and there's a few others, okay? And the idea is a very good one. It's based on a very, very important fact that Dr. Jim Allison and others discovered, which is that cancers have the ability to confuse and turn down the immune system. So the immune response can be inhibited by the cancer itself. So it's like a fifth column within the body that's preventing your armed forces from being able to act. Okay, so what the brilliance of what Jim Allison did, who discovered Yervoy, was to figure out a way chemically to block the interaction of the cancer cell with the immune cell, the crosstalk that goes on between the cancer and the immune system, and to block that, and then then the immune system is able to be activated. This can be very, very effective in melanoma. It's something like 50% or 60% of the patients, melanoma stage 4 patients, are now having these major responses and durable remissions from this drug. So I understand the excitement and enthusiasm for it, but through not any fault of Jim Allison, the company Bristol Myers Squibb, which owns both Yervoy and Opdivo, set the price of the drug at around $150,000, and if they give it in combination, which is the most effective way, the price can go up to $1 million per person. And some oncologists in Latin America analyzed the situation, and they said, they were in Chile, country of Chile, and they said only 10% of the population would even be covered through insurance for this type of treatment. And we'll forget about the people who don't have insurance, but just of the insured population. And in Peru, a less affluent country, only 5% of the population would be covered for that treatment. So you could be sure that 95% of humanity will be left out of that kind of treatment, that kind of pricing. It's just out of this world. And the height of absurdity came with a different type of immunotherapy called Kymriah. It's what's also called a CAR T cell therapy. And that drug sells for $475,000 per injection. And we know from the inventor of that treatment, who sort of let the cat out of the bag, because he said that the actual cost of production, it's a living drug. It's a very interesting drug, but it's a living drug. He says that the actual cost of production is $20,000. So $455,000, or about whatever that is, 96%, is profit.
Now, is there any justification for that based on the fact that I'm assuming, to take a devil's advocate position, a drug company would say, look, we had to spend years researching this, and we spent years researching other drugs that didn't work, that we never got paid for.
Yeah. So,
and the cost of running these trials is very expensive, right?
Right. But what most people don't realize, if we want to talk about fairness, is that the vast majority, I think some people have said 100%, of all new cancer drugs are basically researched by the federal government at taxpayer expense.
You mean initially the NIH is doing the basic research?
Exactly. All the basic research of almost all the drugs, the taxpayer pays for to an amazing degree, sometimes up to actually the finished product, which is then handed over to a drug company under very disadvantageous terms to the government. The Taxol, the famous case of the derivative, the only herbal treatment, well, one of the few herbally derived treatments for cancer, Bristol Myers was given a monopoly on the sale and distribution of that drug for an incredibly small amount of money compared to the billions that they made on it. It was a scandal that actually wound them up in court eventually in the old days when drug companies could be taken to court. But the basic,
can they not be taken to court anymore?
Not for what we're talking about, because they passed. I mean, for price gouging and monopoly practices, no, it doesn't happen. But basically, the drug companies, through the corruption of the Congress and the FDA, they passed a law in 2003 that we lived with the consequences of, called the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003. And one of the things that this did, was they slipped in, was that the government, meaning Medicare, Medicaid, and VA, could not contest the prices, could not negotiate over the price of the drug. So it's like if you go to a plumber and you say, you can charge me anything you want, go ahead, just whatever it is, I'm going to pay it, and I have no recourse to, and the public is demanding that you give them that drug because of good public relations and complicity of the media. So they got that law passed. They got it passed at 3 a.m. By one vote in the Senate. An emergency. They called a surprise vote. The proponents of the bill, 3 a.m. A lot of the opponents were not there, and they pushed it through. And we've lived with the consequences of this.
And by the way, the sole reason why the same drugs are cheaper in Canada than the United States is simply because they have a universal health care system that goes through the government, and the government negotiates those prices down. That's the main reason why.
We wouldn't, I mean, I'm in favor of a Medicare for all system, but we wouldn't have even needed a Medicare for all system. All we needed was for Medicare to have the right and the requirement to economize on behalf of the American public by negotiating over the price. It wouldn't have been perfect, but you wouldn't see $150,000, $175,000, much less $475,000 drugs. It would be impossible. You know why? Because, like, you look at Great Britain, which has a special committee. They have National Health Service, so they have a special committee that judges the value of the drug. They have formulas that they work out and everything. But the basic bottom line is that sometimes they will say, no, well, we don't want it. It's not enough of an innovation over the previous drug, and it's not cost effective. And invariably, what happens is that the company then comes back and says, all right, well, how about half? Would you do half? And then they'll look at it again. They run their numbers and they say, no, still no good. And the company will come back, all right, we'll take a quarter. Because 95% of the price is markup.
Right. And by the way, these companies justify it partially by talking about how much they spend on research and development. And the fact is these companies spend more money on marketing than they do on research and development.
Overwhelmingly so. Overwhelmingly.
And that same provision was written into the Obamacare Affordable Care Act that was written into the Medicare bill.
Yeah. Because if you look at opensecrets.org, and you can see to the penny how much the drug companies are giving to the different campaigns, so-called, of the Congress people.
Yeah, there are 3 times as many lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry than there are for every member of Congress.
Correct. There's between, because this came out at the time of that bill, the Medicare Modernization Act, but also more recently the Precision Medicine Initiative, which was Obama's pride and joy. 1,350 drug company lobbyists were creeping and crawling all over the Congress, which is exactly what you said. 3 times, three lobbyists for each and every member of Congress. And the money just flows like water. And this is
But
our money.
in defense of the Congress people, that's the system we have. They can't get reelected unless they can raise millions of dollars.
Well, Bernie Sanders did it. I mean, he didn't win,
Well,
but it wasn't for lack of money. That's a
right,
different issue.
right. Well, but that's an exception. But that's an exception. That's not that easy to do.
And there are other countries that have public funding of elections and don't allow.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So it's a soluble problem. But the fact is that corruption, there's always going to be people who are going to find an excuse for corruption, but the corruption is there. And a big part of my book, of Cancer Incorporated, is concerned with how this money flows to the oncology profession. And I don't just mean the profession individually, but individual payment to leading what I call key opinion leaders, KOLs, the key opinion leaders within oncology, the most influential doctors, the ones who show up as first author, second author, and final author on the key clinical trial papers. Most of those people are in the pay personally of the drug companies. And this is public knowledge. There's a website called Open Payment Data. It's run by the Medicare facility. This is one good thing that came out of the Obama era, care era. And it basically stipulates that the drug companies have to reveal to the penny how much they're giving to individual doctors, which is amazing because it isn't just like, oh, we gave 10 billion to the oncologists. No, this, you can enter in the name of the doctor, the medical doctor, American medical doctors, and see who they took how much from. And it's very interesting because most of the situations that I looked at, and I looked at a lot of different clinical trials, as you could imagine, it's a pattern that the key researchers, the key opinion leaders, and many of the other people included in that paper as well, the top people, the top academics, are taking personal payments. And I want to emphasize the word personal. They call this general payments. And what that means is, I think that's a euphemism, but what it means is we're not talking about the money they take for their lab or their clinic to do the research on these drugs, which is questionable in and of itself. And undoubtedly, you bring $12 million into your institution, you're gonna rise. You're gonna climb up that totem pole. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how much money you took to put your kid through a fancy school or fancy college, or you took for the yacht, or you took for the second or third home.
Now to play devil's advocate again, I thought it was illegal for doctors to get direct payments from pharmaceutical companies.
No, it's not illegal. This is not, and it never was illegal in oncology. Oncology wrote its own rules, which is called the chemotherapy concession, by which they could buy drugs wholesale and sell them to the patients and get reimbursed at retail rates. At one time, that constituted, according to one source, that constituted 2/3 of the income of oncologists in private practice. The oncologist in private practice makes about, I think the average figure is $367,000, but that means that these people, these individuals, were making the equivalent of $1 million, 2/3 of which came from the sale of chemotherapy, the chemotherapy concession. Now that all changed also with changes to the Medicare reimbursement rules. And so I'm not saying that that's going on to the same degree as it was, because oncology changed from a private practice-centered profession to a group, to working for hospitals, basically. But this is something else. What I'm talking about is something else. This is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's payments for what they describe as honoraria or speakers bureau fees or consulting or different names are given, but it's money that flows for vaguely defined services right into the pocket or to the account of the doctor who's involved in, oftentimes, in evaluating the product of that company. I don't know how much more clear cut it could be. how much more brazen it could be. You're evaluating a drug that people are going to make life and death decisions based upon your statements and your evaluations. And you're going to take up to $3 million from the company who produces that drug. And then you're telling me that you're going to make an objective evaluation of the efficacy of that drug. And, I'm saying again, that they stay on this side of the law by not lying about the results. I'm not accusing them of lying. It's the interpretation of the results. In other words, it increased survival. Well, it did. If you look up survival in the NCI National Cancer Institute Dictionary, and you want to define progression-free survival or disease-free survival as survival, they're not lying. But the way you spin the results, the way you write it up for New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA Oncology or any of the other big journals, that's critical, because the average person is only going to read the headline of the story. Some will read down into the story itself. Some may go look at the title or the abstract of the paper. Believe me, very few people actually read the entire paper through with a critical eye. But when you do that, you see there's no there. There's nothing there.
Right.
It doesn't do anything. And yet they're going to charge you $150,000 for that nothing. What are they selling? Hope, the greatest commodity in the history of the world.
So, Dr. Moss, what are some of the solutions to this situation that we're in?
How about reforming the Congress so that they don't take any more money from corporations?
Well, I think there's a lot of people would like to do that. The problem is since the Supreme Court ruled on Citizens United, there's no way that we could pass a law, even if we wanted to, because it would be overruled by the Supreme Court. So the only two choices we have are A, to have a significant change in the Supreme Court, which is, very difficult and seems to be going the wrong direction right now. Or B, we would have to have a constitutional amendment that would go over the Supreme Court, and we never even passed the women's rights amendment.
I'm totally aware of that. So I mean, I can only put forward utopian solutions.
No, absolutely.
There are, at this moment, we're just sort of spinning our wheels. And I understand that. I'm not saying that I have a solution that's a practical thing that could be implemented right now, because the problem is so pervasive.
Right.
It's so systemic.
Right. No, I think it's totally corrupted all our politics, and having public financing of campaigns and getting rid of the lobbyists absolutely has to be a goal. However, we end up eventually accomplishing it.
I did put, I wrote, a couple of chapters were written in conjunction with other individuals who I think I was very lucky to get their input. And one of them was the final conclusions of the book of Cancer Incorporated. I kind of co-wrote or bounced back and forth with Wayne Jonas, who is my colleague at the Office of Alternative Medicine back in the 90s and was the director of the OAM office, now National Center for Complementary Integrative Health. And I was an advisor to that committee. So Wayne and I have kept in touch for decades now, and he's a brilliant thinker and has thought of many of these, lives in Washington area, has participated in endless discussions at the governmental level. And he and I came to the conclusion, quite to our own surprise, that we felt that the main recommendation we could make would be to nationalize the cancer drug industry. We don't go as far as to say nationalize the whole drug industry. We're not, that wasn't our focus. And I don't really know enough about other areas where the drug industry maybe is better than it is in oncology. But we feel that it's actually an impediment to the overall drug development in the United States, that the NIH and the NCI already does the heavy lifting in terms of drug development and could do a better job. And by better job, what I mean is that they wouldn't have the same pressures that the drug industry has to show increased profits every quarter, because that's the imperative of Wall Street, of capitalism. That's, and so we felt that the scientists would still do their work. You could, and you don't even need the patent system. You could reward people. You could give them amazing rewards for discovering new drugs and new treatments based upon actual benefit to people. I'm talking about large rewards. You could give 50 million or $100 million to people who discover an effective new treatment. Why? Because you're already, every year the world is spending about $120 billion on cancer drugs, most of which, as we see, 95% of which is pure profit to the industry. And it's spinning, and they're spinning their wheels.
So essentially what you're saying, Doc, is right now, for those people who don't realize that National Institutes of Health does a lot of the basic research. They're finding out maybe some of the mechanisms, the molecular processes, et cetera. Yeah. And then that's all done, paid for by the taxpayers, done by the National Institutes of Health. And then the pharmaceutical companies cherry pick what they see as the more promising research and then do the last steps and get all the money for the drugs. And so you're saying just have the National Institutes of Health just finish the process and take those promising processes and develop the drug and market it and not and not have those huge profits to the benefit of the taxpayers.
Right. And I fully and freely admit I didn't come up with this idea. What happened is that in the course of writing the book last summer, an article appeared in JAMA Oncology. JAMA is, for those who don't know, is Journal of the American Medical Association, advocating exactly this for cancer drugs. I mean, it blew my mind, and Wayne Jonas as well, because he's the one who actually brought it to my attention the day this appeared. Look at this, and we hadn't even gone that far in our thinking.
Now, one of the immediate objections is going to be, well, we know that government can't do anything well. They are totally inefficient. The private sector always does things better.
So you talk about immune checkpoint inhibitors, okay? Immune checkpoint inhibitor, the most important advance in cancer treatment in at least 25 years, came about by entirely by government funding, NIH and National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute grant to a salaried employee of a public institution. James Allison was a professor of virology and immunology at the University of California, Berkeley, a public institution, which used to be free, by the way. So the entire development of the immune checkpoint drugs up until the point where he had to find a private firm to take it over, which eventually wound up to be Bristol Myers Squibb. So government funded, government run, government laboratory, government paid, and the drugs were all invented there. And I could tell you many other drugs. Adriamycin were developed by the government, had to be handed over to a private company. That to invent a private company because none of the drug companies wanted to touch it. It wasn't profitable enough. Taxol, entirely developed within NIH, and then NIH-funded lab in New York, at a public hospital in New York City. It just isn't the case. The government functions very well in the realm of biomedicine, but nothing's ever going to be public. I'm not saying that some utopian era is going to dawn if of course, you always in life, you go from one set of problems to another one at a quote unquote higher level, but there's still problems. You solved one problem and then, you get another problem. I mean, that's just the nature of reality. So yes, we will have issues if the government takes over the drug. But you know what? And I felt this way when I was consulting for almost 9 years for the government. As bad as it was, you still could drag somebody up before a committee and drill them and find out and investigate and find out where and there is that potential for public exposure and disclosure, right? And I said about the government runs the website that lets us see the degree of corruption of the oncology profession. It doesn't happen automatically, but I saw it happen with my own eyes. It can happen. And so it's always going to be a problem. To administer a country of 320 million people is never going to be easy, and much less a world with whatever, 7 or 8 billion people. But at least there's some disclosure. What goes on inside the boardroom at Bristol Myers Squibb? You don't know, and I don't know, and we'll never know. Or the boardroom at Memorial Sloan Kettering, private institution. You'll never know. This is kept close to the vest. But one thing you can be sure of, that the imperatives of a private corporation, especially a corporation that's traded on the stock exchange and is competitive with other companies and so forth, that their imperatives are profit and growth. That's what, and it usually is on the quarterly basis. They're all racing to show that how well they did, because Wall Street will react even to one quarter downturn. So they're kind of a cancer, because they have to keep on growing and spreading and metastasizing, and that's their imperative. You don't have the same imperative.
It's really the system, not the companies, because
Correct.
Public corporations, they're required to maximize profits, to maximize shareholder value.
Right, and even if they weren't, they'd still have to do it, because who would invest in the company that was lagging? And sometimes you get the best results out of privately owned companies, and I own a company, so I'm not saying that companies are necessarily bad, but my son and I were in business together. We could decide, oh well, this quarter we're going to focus on doing something that's not immediately profitable, maybe it's an investment for the future or something, and nobody's except for our wives, nobody's going to criticize or have any word to say about this. But when you're a publicly owned corporation, you've got the lash of profitability at your back, and nothing can stop that. And the really interesting thing was, they held a meeting. This immune checkpoint inhibitor thing is just phenomenally big. I mean, it's billions and billions. One drug alone makes that's Keytruda, makes over $8 or $9 billion a year.
Wow!
Everybody wants in on this, and the FDA last year held a meeting, and they brought together whoever wanted to come to discuss the development of new cancer drugs, and it was new immune therapy drugs, and this was chaired by Richard Pazdur, who's considered like the cancer czar in the United States. He's the most powerful person probably at the FDA. And in the course of the meeting, he listened to the presentations from this company, that company, this company, and at the end of their presentation, he said, so now what you're telling me is, I'm paraphrasing, but you're all basically creating the same drug. They all were creating Keytruda, and Keytruda is another version of Opdivo. What does that mean? It means that everybody wants in on the $8.8 billion Keytruda market. And so if I could splinter one little thing, I'll take a cancer, a very, very small portion of that. Maybe I'll just take an angiosarcoma and I'll run my drug against that drug, and I find that there's some positive thing. Now that's not covered by your patent. I've just cut away a little sliver. What can I do with that? The drug could be then extended into other kinds of cancer, become competitive with your big drug, or I could sell it out to the highest bidder, because even a sliver of the cancer market is worth billions of dollars. So big, huge market. So, but the head, basically, I call him the head of the FDA, and the top most influential person in cancer in the FDA, basically said, it's all the same, isn't it? It's all the same drug. So you've got hundreds of companies competing to create a drug that already exists. In fact, it already exists in two forms. There's no innovation going on there. They don't want, innovation's too risky. It's much safer to create a Me Too drug and then cash in your chips 35 years down the road. That's what's going on.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. I'm going to have to bring the discussion to a close because I am still seeing patients at this time, and I do have a patient coming up. So maybe you can tell everybody how they can get a hold of your reports and find out more information about you.
So our website is Moss Reports, MOSSREPORTS.com. And I'll hold up a copy of my book, Cancer Incorporated. And this book, just 250 pages in length, including all the references, is available for free as an ebook at our website. So you just go to mossreports.com/Cancer Inc. or Cancer Incorporated, and you download a copy of the book. We wanted to get this out to as many people as possible, or you can get a paperback of it if you choose. That's not free, but not expensive either. So that's and our Moss Reports. We have 38 diagnosis or disease-specific reports on different forms of cancer, and I do phone consultations as well. So we're busy. We're active. I've been doing this for 45 years, and hopefully we'll do it another 45 years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. Fascinating discussion and a great contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.